The phone call came at 11 p.m. on December 23, 1964, 9 weeks after Malcolm X had publicly broken with the Nation of Islam and 8 weeks before assassins would gun him down at the Audubon Ballroom. And when Malcolm answered the phone in his Queens home where his wife Betty and 4 young daughters were sleeping upstairs, he heard a voice he recognized instantly, even though they hadn't spoken in months. Brother Malcolm Tissie's Bumpy. "I'm calling because I hear things on the street that you need to know about, things that concern your safety and your family's safety, things that can't wait until morning to discuss." Malcolm X had known Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for years, had visited him at Alcatraz during his imprisonment, had corresponded with him about strategies for black economic independence and community, had respected him as elder statesman who'd navigated white-dominated power structures while maintaining black autonomy in ways that offered lessons for civil rights struggle, but they'd maintained distance recently because Malcolm's increasingly public profile made associations with convicted criminals politically complicated, and because Bumpy had been carefully rebuilding his Harlem operations after returning from nearly 11 years in federal prison and didn't need attention that came with being connected to controversial figure like Malcolm. But tonight, Bumpy was calling, despite those complications. Calling because intelligence from his network of informants throughout Harlem's criminal underworld had revealed information that Malcolm needed to hear regardless of political inconvenience or strategic considerations. Information that could mean difference between Malcolm living to continue his work and Malcolm becoming another casualty of internecine conflict within black community, another leader, eliminated not by white supremacists, but by other black people who viewed him as threat rather than ally. "What have you heard?" Malcolm asked, his voice calm despite knowing that calls like this at this hour never brought good news, that Bumpy wouldn't risk potential surveillance by making contact unless situation was serious enough to justify that risk. "The nation has put a price on your head," Bumpy said without preamble, understanding that Malcolm preferred direct communication to diplomatic $50,000 to anyone who can eliminate you before you cause more damage to Elijah Muhammad's reputation. That's not rumor. That's confirmed information from sources who heard it directly from people close to Elijah, people who are serious about making it happen. Malcolm had known since breaking with the Nation of Islam in March 1964 that his former brothers viewed him as traitor, had known that Elijah Muhammad, the man Malcolm had once called his spiritual father, the leader Malcolm had devoted 12 years of his life to serving, had turned against him with fury that only betrayed mentors can summon to disciples they once loved, had known that the organization he'd helped build into national movement now considered him enemy to be destroyed rather than friend to be welcomed back. But knowing abstractly that the nation wanted him dead was different from hearing specific dollar amount attached to his assassination, from understanding that his murder wasn't just possibility but active plan being pursued by people with resources and connections necessary to make it happen, from recognizing that every day he continued speaking publicly about Elijah Muhammad's corruption and hypocrisy increased likelihood that someone would collect that bounty before federal authorities or his own security team could prevent it. "I appreciate you telling me," Malcolm said carefully, aware that phone might be tapped by FBI agents who'd been monitoring his activities since 1953, aware that anything he said could be used to suggest he was paranoid or that he was planning violence in response to threats, rather than simply defending himself, aware that authorities who'd spent years surveilling him would be more interested in discrediting him than in protecting him from people actively plotting his murder. "Telling you isn't enough," Bumpy responded. "You need protection. Real protection. Not just the bodyguards you have now who mean well but don't have experience dealing with professional hits. The people coming after you aren't amateurs, they're nation enforcers who've been trained to kill, who have resources to plan operations carefully, who won't make mistakes that give you advance warning. You need people who understand how assassinations work, who can identify threats before they materialize, who can respond with force if necessary to deter attacks. Have you ever received warning that changed everything you thought you knew about your situation, that forced you to choose between maintaining appearance of fearlessness and accepting help that acknowledged vulnerability, that required deciding whether pride was worth risking death? Subscribe to understand how one phone call created 8 weeks of safety that ended when pride overcame pragmatism. Malcolm understood what Bumpy was offering. Protection from Harlem's most experienced operator, someone whose organization had defended itself against Italian mafia, corrupt police, rival criminals, and federal authorities for decades, someone who knew how to identify threats and neutralize them before they could materialize. Someone whose reputation alone might deter nation enforcers who'd think twice about attacking target under Bumpy Johnson's protection because retaliation would extend beyond Malcolm's murder to include everyone involved in planning it, but accepting that protection carried costs that extended beyond immediate security benefits. It would mean acknowledging publicly because protection that worked required visible presence of guards who couldn't operate effectively while pretending they weren't there, that Malcolm needed criminal organizations help to stay alive, that legitimate civil rights activism required assistance from illegitimate power structures, that the revolution Malcolm preached couldn't be sustained without support from exactly the kind of street elements that respectable leaders tried to distance themselves from. More significantly, it would confirm what Malcolm's enemies already claimed, that he was working with criminals, that his organization was funded by illegal operations, that his rhetoric about black self-defense was really code for gangster violence, that everything distinguishing him from Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach was evidence of moral corruption rather than tactical difference. "I can't accept criminal protection," Malcolm said finally. Though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "It would undermine everything I'm trying to build, would give my enemies ammunition to discredit me, would make it impossible to maintain moral authority necessary for leading movement based on principles rather than just power." "Brother Malcolm," Bumpy said patiently, "the people trying to kill you don't care about your principles. They care about silencing you before you expose more of Elijah's corruption, before you pull more members away from the nation, before you build alternative organization that threatens their control. If you're dead, your principles don't matter. If you're alive under criminal protection, at least you can continue speaking truth, even if people question your associations." This was the fundamental dilemma that Malcolm faced throughout final year of his life. How to maintain ideological purity while operating in a world where survival required pragmatic compromises. How to advocate for revolution while acknowledging that revolutionary movements needed support from people whose methods and motives didn't align perfectly with revolutionary principles. How to critique existing power structures while accepting that challenging those structures required building alternative power bases that operated by some of same rules you were critiquing. Bumpy understood this dilemma better than most people, because he'd lived version of it throughout his career. How to build black power within system designed to prevent black people from accumulating power. How to maintain respect within community while engaging in activities that community officially condemned. How to navigate between legitimacy and illegitimacy when structural racism ensured that most paths to power available to black people were coded as illegitimate, regardless of whether they actually harmed anyone. "Let me propose something," Bumpy continued when Malcolm didn't immediately respond. "Accept protection for limited time. 8 weeks while you assess threat level and develop your own security protocols. Keep my people in background so they're not, obviously, criminals guarding civil rights leader. If during those 8 weeks you build security team that can handle professional threats, then you can transition away from my protection. If you discover that threat is even more serious than you thought, then you'll already have infrastructure in place to keep you alive long enough to do the work you need to do." 8 weeks. That was until mid-February 1965. Enough time to get through holidays when Malcolm would be particularly vulnerable because his public appearances were less frequent and his movements more predictable. Enough time to train his own security team properly. Enough time to see whether nations' threats materialized into actual attempts that would help Malcolm understand severity of danger he faced. "And what do you want in exchange?" Malcolm asked, because he knew that favors in Harlem, even favors, offered for principled reasons created obligations that eventually came due. That accepting help meant accepting relationship with helper. That protection provided by someone like Bumpy Johnson wasn't charity, but investment in connection. That might pay dividends later, when Bumpy needed something that only Malcolm could provide. "Nothing," Bumpy said simply. "I'm doing this because you're important to Harlem, because what you're building matters more than any disagreement I might have with your methods, Because letting the nation kill you would be worse for black people than any political complications that come from me protecting you. You don't owe me anything. Except this. Don't refuse protection out of pride. When pride might get you killed, that's all I ask. Comment below whether you would accept help from someone whose methods you questioned if refusing that help meant risking death. Whether ideological purity matters more than survival when survival enables continued work toward goals you believe in. Whether accepting compromised protection is weakness or pragmatism when alternatives don't exist. Malcolm agreed to 8 weeks of protection starting December 26, 1964, and ending February 19, 1965. 8 weeks, during which Bumpy's people provided security that own bodyguards couldn't provide because they lacked experience that came from years of navigating Harlem's violent power struggles. 8 weeks, during which multiple threats were identified and neutralized before they could materialize into actual attacks. 8 weeks during which Malcolm lived to continue speaking about Elijah Muhammad's corruption and building organization of unity without constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering whether today would be day dead. Nation enforcers finally succeeded. The protection wasn't obvious Bumpies, people dressed like regular community members attending Malcolm's speeches rather than like criminals providing security. They positioned themselves strategically rather than hovering obviously around Malcolm. They communicated through signals that looked casual rather than through radios and commands that would draw attention, but it was effective because it came from understanding how street violence actually worked rather than from theoretical knowledge about how protection should work. During those 8 weeks, Bumpy's network identified 3 separate attempts that Nation members planned, one involving shooter positioned outside mosque, where Malcolm was scheduled to speak, one involving bomb planted in car Malcolm regularly used, one involving ambush at restaurant, where Malcolm often ate breakfast. In each case, Bumpy's people intervened before plans could be executed, not through violence that would have made news and confirmed everyone's worst assumptions about criminal protection, but through quiet conversations with Nation members that made clear that attacking Malcolm would trigger responses extending far beyond Malcolm's immediate security team, that Bumpy Johnson had personal interest in keeping Malcolm alive, that $50,000 bounty wasn't worth war with someone who'd been protecting Harlem longer than most Nation members had been alive. But on February 19th, the day, Malcolm told interviewer Gordon Parks that Nation of Islam was actively trying to kill him. The day protection was scheduled to end according to agreement Malcolm and Bumpy had made 8 weeks earlier. Malcolm informed Bumpy that he wouldn't be renewing protection arrangement, that he'd developed his own security protocols during intervening weeks, that continuing to rely on criminal organizations' help would undermine credibility he needed to maintain as legitimate civil rights leader rather than gangster operating under different name. Bumpy tried to change Malcolm's mind. He pointed out that threats hadn't diminished during 8 weeks of protection but had actually intensified. That Nation was becoming more desperate as Malcolm continued exposing Elijah Muhammad's corruption. That transitioning away from proven protection to untested security team during period of elevated threat was exactly when assassins would strike because they'd recognize vulnerability created by transition. But Malcolm was adamant. He couldn't continue accepting protection that connected him to criminal enterprise. He needed to demonstrate fearlessness that would inspire people following his movement. He had to show that he trusted in Allah's protection more than in any human security arrangement. And he believed or wanted to believe that his own security team had learned enough during 8 weeks to handle threats without Bumpy's continued involvement. 5 days later, on February 14, 1965, Molotov cocktails crashed through windows of Malcolm's home in Queens at 2:45 a.m., while he, Betty, and their 4 daughters slept inside. Flames spreading quickly through first floor, smoke filling rooms. Malcolm grabbing children and rushing them outside into freezing February night, standing on street watching house burn while knowing exactly who'd ordered attack and understanding that this was final warning before they came for him directly. The phone call came 3 hours later at 5:47 a.m. Malcolm standing outside his burned house, wrapped in borrowed coat because his own clothes had been destroyed in fire. Reporters already gathering to photograph damage and quote Malcolm about whether he blamed Nation for attack. Police pretending to investigate while everyone knew they wouldn't pursue leads that might require actually protecting controversial black leader from other black people when authorities would prefer that internal. Conflicts within black community resolved themselves through violence that eliminated troublesome activists. "Brother Malcolm, this is Bumpy," the voice said when Malcolm answered cell phone that hadn't been in-house during fire and therefore still worked. "I heard about what happened. I'm sending people right now. They'll be there within an hour to provide security until we can discuss long-term arrangements. Don't refuse this. Don't tell me you have situation under control. Your house just got firebombed with your family inside. The next attack won't be warning, it'll be execution. Let me protect you until this is resolved." This was the call that could have changed history, the urgent plea from someone who understood violence better than anyone in Malcolm's circle, who recognized that firebombing was exactly the kind of escalation that preceded assassinations, who knew from decades of experience that people willing to attack someone's family weren't going to stop until target was eliminated, who could provide protection that would actually work rather than protection that looked good for cameras but couldn't prevent determined killers from completing their mission. And Malcolm refused. Not because he didn't understand danger, not because he thought his own security was adequate, not because he didn't appreciate what Bumpy was offering or didn't recognize that accepting might save his life. He refused because accepting would mean admitting he'd been wrong 5 days earlier when he'd ended protection arrangement, would mean acknowledging that he needed help he'd just rejected, would mean appearing weak or indecisive or dependent on criminal networks at precisely the moment when he most needed to project strength and self-sufficiency to followers who were watching how he responded to attack on his home and family. He refused because he believed or needed to believe that showing fear or accepting protection would undermine the message of fearlessness he'd been preaching, that great leaders faced death without flinching, that revolution required willingness to sacrifice everything including personal safety for principles that mattered more than individual survival. He refused because of pride, because of principle, because of political calculation, because of theological conviction that Allah would protect those who submitted to divine will, because of all the complicated reasons that make people choose paths they know are dangerous over paths they know are safer, that make revolutionaries embrace martyrdom rather than compromise, that make leaders value symbolic gestures over practical security. Have you ever watched someone refuse help that could save them because accepting that help would require admitting vulnerability they're not willing to acknowledge, because survival seemed less important than maintaining appearance of control, because dying on principle felt more meaningful than living with compromise? Leave a like if you understand that sometimes the most tragic decisions aren't made out of ignorance, but out of full knowledge of consequences combined with belief that something matters more than avoiding those consequences. "Brother Malcolm," Bumpy said carefully, understanding that pushing too hard would only make Malcolm more resistant. "I respect your decision, and I understand your reasoning. But I'm asking you to consider something. Your movement needs you alive more than it needs you to be seen as fearless. Your family needs you alive more than they need you to be martyr. Your work is not finished. You have decades of organizing ahead of you if you survive next few weeks. Don't let pride or principle prevent you from living long enough to accomplish what you started." Response would become famous, would be quoted in every subsequent account of his final days, would encapsulate everything about his approach to danger during those last weeks. "I'm already dead. The moment I left the nation, I was marked for death. The only question now is whether I die soon or later, and whether I die standing up or running away. I choose to die standing up, and I choose to die soon rather than live in fear. If Allah wills that I should be assassinated, then I will be assassinated. If Allah wills that I should live, then I will live. But I will not hide. I will not compromise. I will not accept protection that requires me to acknowledge that I need it." Bumpy tried one more time. "Brother Malcolm, there's no shame in accepting protection. Every president has Secret Service. Every leader has security. Every revolutionary needs people willing to take bullets so the revolution can continue. Let me provide that protection. Let me give you time to finish building what you started. Don't mistake stubbornness for courage." "I appreciate what you're offering," Malcolm said with finality that indicated conversation was ending. "But My decision is made. I cannot accept criminal protection for political movement. I cannot build revolution on foundation of compromise with elements I'm trying to move beyond. I cannot teach black people to stand up for themselves while I hide behind bodyguards provided by criminal enterprise. If that means I die sooner, then at least I die consistent with principles I've lived by. And that was it. The call ended. The protection was refused. The countdown began. 7 days later, on February 21st, 1965, at approximately 3:10 p.m., Malcolm X walked onto stage at Audubon Ballroom in Harlem to address Organization of Afro-American Unity. His own security team, present but untrained in recognizing threats that Bumpy's people would have spotted instantly. His vulnerability obvious to anyone who understood how assassinations worked. His decision to refuse professional protection about two exact costs that everyone except Malcolm seemed to understand was inevitable. The disruption began at 3:13 p.m. when someone in the audience yelled, "Nigger, get your hand out of my pocket," creating confusion that drew attention away from stage toward back a hall, creating moment of distraction when Malcolm's bodyguards looked away from him to assess source of commotion, creating exactly the kind of opportunity that professional killers create when they want to ensure their target is exposed before they strike. 3 seconds later, man rushed forward from front row and fired sawed-off shotgun at point-blank range into Malcolm's chest. As Malcolm fell backward, two more gunmen charged stage firing semi-automatic pistols, continuing to shoot, even as Malcolm lay on stage floor, ensuring he was dead before security could respond, ensuring that years of work and decades of potential organizing were eliminated in less than 30 seconds of coordinated violence. 21 gunshot wounds, multiple weapons. Coordinated attack. Professional execution. Exactly the kind of assassination that Bumpy's protection could have prevented, not because Bumpy's people could have stopped determined killers from eventually succeeding, but because Bumpy's presence would have deterred nation from even attempting attack, because $50,000 bounty wasn't worth war with someone who'd made clear he had personal investment in keeping Malcolm alive. The phone call came to Bumpy at 3:27 p.m., 17 minutes after assassination. One of his informants who'd been at Audubon Ballroom calling to report what everyone in Harlem would know within an hour. Malcolm X had been shot, was being rushed to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, was almost certainly dead because nobody survived shotgun blast to chest at close range, followed by multiple pistol shots. Bumpy didn't say anything for a long moment after hearing news. Then he said 7 words that would haunt him for remaining 3 years of his life. "I could have saved him if he'd let me." Subscribe for more stories about moments when pride prevented survival, when refusing help cost everything, when one phone call could have changed history if only the person receiving it had been willing to accept what was being offered, when tragedy resulted not from lack of warning but from inability to acknowledge that warning was accurate. The aftermath unfolded exactly as everyone except Malcolm had predicted. 3 nation members were arrested, tried, and convicted, though 2 were later exonerated when evidence emerged showing they weren't actually present at Assassination, funeral attended by thousands of mourners, recognizing too late how much they'd lose by Malcolm's death. Investigations that raised more questions than they answered about whether FBI or CIA had been involved in creating conditions that enabled assassination. Decades of speculation about what Malcolm might have accomplished if he'd lived past age 30. And Bumpy Johnson lived with knowledge that he'd offered protection that could have prevented it, that he'd made one phone call that could have changed history if Malcolm had accepted what was being offered, that sometimes the most powerful person in room is person offering help rather than person refusing it, that martyrdom might be noble, but survival enables continued work toward goals, that martyrdom only what Bumpy understood, what Malcolm understood intellectually, but couldn't accept emotionally, was that revolutionary movements need living leaders more than they need dead martyrs, that symbolic gestures of fearlessness matter less than practical realities, of staying alive long enough to organize communities and build institutions, that accepting protection doesn't mean compromising principles, but rather means recognizing that principles can't be advanced by people who are dead. 3 years later, in July 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. His final years marked by continued organizing and continued attempts to protect. Harlem's interests against encroachment by Italian mob and corrupt authorities. His legacy including not just his criminal enterprises but also his efforts to shield community leaders from violence they couldn't defend against alone. Before 88, Bumpy told several people about the phone calls with Malcolm, about the 8 weeks of successful protection followed by the refusal that led to assassination, about his frustration that someone as intelligent as Malcolm would choose death over compromise, about his understanding that sometimes principles matter more to people than survival, even when survival would enable those principles to actually be implemented rather than just symbolized. Malcolm was greatest leader of our generation, Bumpy said in interview months before his death, but he made one mistake that cost him everything. He thought that accepting help from someone like me would undermine his credibility, would make him look weak or compromised. He didn't understand that strength comes not from refusing all help, but from accepting help that enables you to continue doing work that matters, even if that help comes from sources that aren't ideologically pure. I offered him protection that would have saved his life. He refused it because he thought principles mattered more than survival. Maybe he was right, maybe martyrdom accomplished more than continued organizing would have, but I don't think so. I think we lost decades of leadership because one man couldn't accept that. Revolution requires pragmatism as well as principles. The tragedy of Malcolm X's assassination wasn't that nobody warned him, it wasn't that security was impossible, it wasn't that violence was inevitable. The tragedy was that protection was offered, was proven effective during 8 weeks when it was accepted, and then was refused at exactly the moment when it was most needed because accepting it would have required acknowledging vulnerability that Malcolm wasn't willing to acknowledge. Because revolution seemed to require fearlessness that couldn't coexist with visible security measures, because dying on principle felt more authentic than living with compromise. The one call that could have changed history, the call from Bumpy Johnson on February 14, 1965, offering to reactivate protection after Malcolm's house was firebombed, was made, it was received, it was understood, it was refused. And 7 days later, Malcolm X was dead. Not because warning wasn't given, not because protection wasn't available, not because danger wasn't recognized, but because sometimes knowing danger exists isn't enough. Sometimes having protection available isn't enough. Sometimes being warned repeatedly isn't enough. Sometimes people choose paths they know are dangerous because those paths align with principles they value more than safety. Because living with compromise feels worse than dying with integrity. Because martyrdom serves causes that survival might complicate. Malcolm X was marked for death from the moment he left the Nation of Islam. Bumpy Johnson made one call that could have saved him, actually made multiple calls, offering protection that worked when accepted, and could have continued working, if not refused. But the call that mattered most, the urgent plea after the firebombing, couldn't change history because history sometimes depends, not on what's offered but on what's accepted, not on what's available but on what's chosen, not on what could have prevented tragedy but on what pride, principle, or conviction prevents people from accepting, even when accepting might mean surviving long enough to accomplish goals that death only That's the story that needs to be told. Not just that Malcolm X was assassinated by Nation of Islam members who viewed him as traitor, but that his assassination could have been prevented by accepting protection from someone who understood violence better than anyone in his circle, someone who'd proven that protection worked during 8 weeks when it was accepted, someone who made one final desperate call offering help that was refused, for reasons that seemed important at time but look heartbreakingly misguided in hindsight when we know what happened 7 days later. Bumpy Johnson made the call. Malcolm X refused the help. History turned on that refusal. And for 3 years, until his own death, Bumpy lived with knowledge that he'd offered salvation that was rejected. That one phone call had created a moment where history could have gone different direction if only one decision had been made differently. That sometimes the most important calls aren't the ones that change everything, but the ones that could have changed everything if only the person receiving them had been willing to let change